The river was the only thing standing between him and being burned alive. He was a priest. He had never learned to fight a fire like this because nobody had ever seen a fire like this. In less than 1 hour, his entire town would be gone, wiped off the map, along with over 1,000 people who lived in it. This is the deadliest fire in American history, and there's a reason you've never heard of it. October 1871. A small logging town on the edge of Wisconsin called Peshtigo. 2,000 people lived here. Sawmills, a factory that made wooden buckets and tubs, wooden sidewalks, wooden houses, a wooden church. The entire town built almost completely out of the one material that burns fastest. The man at the center of this story was Father Peter Pernin, the parish priest. He served not just Peshtigo, but the neighboring town of Marnet too, which meant he was constantly traveling between them, watching both towns from the outside, the way only a traveler can. And for weeks, something had felt wrong. The summer had been the driest anyone could remember. No real rain since July. The forests around Peshtigo, thick, endless pine and hemlock, had turned into something closer to kindling than trees. Smoke had been drifting over the region for days, thin and constant, from smaller brush fires nobody worried about. Loggers burned off scrubland all the time. It was routine. Nobody thought twice about it. On October 7th, the day before everything changed, Father Pernin was supposed to travel north by steamboat. The boat came close to the dock and then turned away. The smoke over the water was too thick, too dangerous even to stop. He didn't know it yet, but that was the last warning anyone would get. That Sunday morning, Peshtigo looked exactly like it always did. The sawmill was quiet for the day of rest, but smoke still rose gently from a few chimneys. Children played in yards stacked with firewood for the coming winter. Families were getting ready for church. Somewhere, someone was probably complaining about the heat or the dry air, the way people always complain about weather without imagining it could kill them. Nobody in Peshtigo thought of themselves as living somewhere dangerous. This was a working town. Loggers, mill workers, shopkeepers, families who had moved here for the jobs the timber industry provided. The forest wasn't a threat. It was the reason the town existed at all. By nightfall, that would no longer be true. October 8th. A Sunday. By evening, the wind had picked up, hard from the southwest, gusting harder than anyone remembered. And with it came a sound. Not the crackle of a normal fire, a roar, deep and constant, like a train that never stopped passing. Within minutes, the sky above Peshtigo turned red. What happened next had no name yet in 1871. Today, we'd call it a firestorm, or more precisely, a fire tornado. The heat was so extreme, so fast, that it created its own weather. Superheated air rushed upward with such force that it pulled in wind from every direction, spinning burning debris hundreds of feet into the air. Balls of fire, actual balls of flame, leapt from treetop to treetop, from rooftop to rooftop, far ahead of the main fire itself. The fire wasn't just spreading, it was jumping. People had seconds, not minutes, to decide what to do. Father Pernin ran toward the church, thinking first, instinctively, of the sacred objects inside. He grabbed what he could, and then he stepped back outside into a town that no longer looked like the one he'd left an hour before. The heat was already unbearable at 100 yards. Wooden buildings weren't catching fire one at a time. They were igniting in waves, as if the air itself had become flammable. Horses screamed and bolted. People ran through streets that were disappearing behind them. There was only one place left to go: the Peshtigo River. Modern fire scientists have a name for what struck Peshtigo: a fire whirl, or more accurately, a full-scale firestorm, one of the earliest and most extreme ever documented. When a fire burns hot and fast enough over a large enough area, it can start generating its own wind system. Rising heat pulls in air from every direction at once, and that inrushing air can start to spin, sometimes into genuine tornado-like vortices of flame, capable of moving faster than a person can run, and hot enough to ignite things it never even touched. In other words, the people of Peshtigo weren't just fleeing a fire, they were fleeing something closer to a weather event. And in 1871, there was no science, no warning system, and no name for what was coming for them. The river cut straight through the middle of town, about 400 feet across at its widest, cold, fast-moving, and suddenly the only thing standing between 2,000 people and a fire that was consuming the town whole. Father Pernin waded in. The water came up past his waist, then his chest. All around him, families were doing the same, pulling children in, holding onto floating logs, standing shoulder-deep in water that should have felt freezing, except the air itself was hot enough that the cold barely registered. But the river wasn't safe. Not entirely. Flaming debris, branches, planks, entire pieces of roof flew through the air and landed on the water's surface around them. People wrapped themselves in wet blankets and quilts for protection. Within minutes, some of those blankets caught fire anyway. The heat in the air simply too intense. People had to duck fully underwater again and again just to keep from burning while standing in a river. Some people, in blind panic, tried to run back toward their homes to save belongings, or animals, or photographs, and never made it back to the water. Not everyone made it to the river. Some families, unable to reach the water in time, climbed into wells instead, believing the ground itself would protect them. In several documented cases, the heat above ground was so extreme that the water in those wells began to boil while people were still standing in it. One survivor account tells of a 13-year-old girl, a recent immigrant, who couldn't swim and had no log or blanket to hold on to. She survived the entire night, gripping the horns of a cow that had waded into the river beside her. Using the animal as an anchor in water she couldn't have stood in alone. Father Pernin later described watching a phenomenon he had no word for. Fire that seemed to move like liquid, flowing across open ground the way water flows downhill, consuming everything in a matter of seconds rather than minutes. For hours, so through the entire night, the people in the Peshtigo River held their position, watching their town disappear above the waterline, ducking under whenever the heat became too much. Some held children above the surface with arms that eventually gave out from exhaustion. Some simply couldn't hold on any longer. By the time the fire began to weaken sometime after midnight, the town of Peshtigo, every building, nearly every structure, was gone. When the sun rose on October 9th, there was almost nothing left to recognize. The fire hadn't stopped at Peshtigo. It had burned through more than 1 million acres of Wisconsin and Michigan, an area larger than the state of Rhode Island, destroying at least 16 other towns in a matter of hours. The death toll has never been precisely confirmed because entire families, entire households of records simply ceased to exist. Historians estimate somewhere between 1,200 and 2,500 people died that night. Some estimates go even higher. It remains, to this day, the deadliest wildfire in the history of the United States. Father Pernin survived. He spent the following weeks helping to identify and bury the dead, and later wrote down everything he had witnessed. One of the only detailed first-hand accounts of that night that still exists today. And here's the part that still seems almost impossible. This happened on the exact same night as the Great Chicago Fire. Same date, nearly the same hour. The Chicago Fire killed roughly 300 people and destroyed a few square miles of a major American city, and it became one of the most famous disasters in American history, remembered in textbooks, museums, movies. The Peshtigo Fire killed at minimum 4 times as many people. It destroyed an area larger than some entire states, and almost nobody has ever heard of it. Why? Because Chicago was a city that mattered to the country's newspapers, its politicians, its historians. Peshtigo was a small logging town in the middle of nowhere. When the news of both fires reached the rest of the country at the same time, there was only room in the headlines for one of them. Father Pernin's account remained one of the only ways the world could piece together what had actually happened that night. A night when a small town on a river became the site of the deadliest fire in American history, and the country barely noticed. 2,000 people called Peshtigo home. We'll likely never know the exact number who didn't survive the night, but we know this. For hours, standing in a cold river while their town burned above the waterline, they held on, together, waiting for a fire that had no precedent and no name to finally burn itself out. If this story moved you, take a second to subscribe. There's a new true survival story here every week, and I'd love to know, what's a survival story you've heard about that you think deserves more attention? Drop it in the comments. Some of my best video ideas have come from viewers just like you.